The cleaning lady heard the millionaire's daughter crying every night. What her father was doing. Emma Carter tightened the straps of her worn leather bag as she stepped out of the cab. Her breath catching in her throat as she took in the sight before her. The Johnson mansion loomed against the backdrop of an overcast sky. Its grand, neoclassical columns standing like silent sentinels, guarding the secrets within. It was the kind of house most people only saw in magazines, its sprawling gardens perfectly manicured. The towering iron gates gleaming under the cold morning light. It reeked of wealth, of power. And yet, despite its perfection, something about it felt off. A chill ran down Emma's spine, though she convinced herself it was just the autumn air. At 28, she had worked as a housekeeper in several estates before, but never one quite like this. There was an unnatural stillness to the mansion, as though it wasn't just a home but a museum where time had stopped. Taking a deep breath, she adjusted her apron and walked toward the massive double doors, each step feeling heavier than the last. As she reached for the ornate brass knocker, the doors swung open before she could touch them. A stern-looking woman stood in the doorway, arms crossed over her chest, her sharp gaze scanning Emma from head to toe. She was tall, broad-shouldered, with a no-nonsense expression that instantly made Emma stand a little straighter. "You're the new one?" The woman's voice was clipped, her tone carrying the weight of someone who had spent years keeping the household in order. "Yes, ma'am, Emma Carter," she replied, keeping her voice steady. The woman nodded but didn't return the courtesy of an introduction. "Follow me." Emma obeyed, stepping inside and instantly feeling the coldness settle into her bones, not from the temperature, but from the atmosphere itself. The air was thick with an unspoken tension, pressing against her skin like an invisible weight. As they walked down the long marble hallway, Emma took in her surroundings. The house was a masterpiece of wealth, pristine white floors, chandeliers dripping with crystals, paintings of somber-faced ancestors staring down at her with hollow eyes. But despite the elegance, there was no warmth, no signs of life. "Mr. Leonardo Johnson is very particular about how things are run," the woman continued as they passed a series of closed doors. "He expects perfection at all times. No mistakes, no unnecessary questions. Do your job, stay out of the way, and everything will be fine." Emma nodded, sensing the warning beneath the words. "Your quarters are in the staff wing. Breakfast is served at 6 sharp. You'll clean the main hallways, the dining room, and the upstairs bedrooms, but you are not to disturb Mr. Johnson unless explicitly called upon." "Understood?" "Yes, ma'am," Emma said, though a question burned at the back of her mind. The woman continued walking, leading Emma through the winding corridors. When they reached the grand staircase, Emma hesitated for a moment, her eyes drifting to a series of framed photographs lining the walls. Family portraits, each one meticulously arranged, perfectly lit. Leonardo Johnson stood in the center of every image, his dark eyes unreadable, his features sharp and commanding. His wife, Clara, stood beside him, beautiful yet distant, her smile never quite reaching her eyes. But it was the little girl that caught Emma's attention. Isabel Johnson. In every photograph, the child appeared solemn, her small frame stiff, her expression vacant. Unlike most children, there was no joy in her eyes, no mischief, no light, just an eerie emptiness. Emma frowned. She had worked in homes with children before, and there was always a certain energy, messy toys, laughter echoing through the halls, tiny fingerprints smudging the glass tabletops. But here, it was as if a child had never truly lived in this house at all. "Who takes care of the little girl?" Emma asked, keeping her voice casual. The woman, who Emma now assumed was the head of staff, paused for a fraction of a second before answering. "No one. Mrs. Johnson is busy with social obligations, and Mr. Johnson has his own way of handling things. Isabel spends most of her time alone in her room." Something about the way she said it made Emma's stomach tighten. But before she could ask anything else, the woman's gaze hardened. "Don't ask too many questions. It's better for you." With that, she resumed walking, and Emma hurried to follow. The first day passed uneventfully, yet the weight of the house settled over Emma like a thick fog. As she dusted the towering bookshelves in the library, polished the crystal decanters in the study, and scrubbed the already spotless marble floors, she noticed the same thing over and over. This house wasn't just cold. It was suffocating. The staff moved like shadows, silent and careful, their eyes never lingering too long on anything. No laughter, no conversations beyond what was necessary. But it wasn't until later that evening that Emma saw Isabel in person for the first time. She was sitting by the window of her bedroom, knees tucked beneath her, a book resting in her lap. Her dark hair fell in soft waves around her small face, her gaze distant as she stared at the gardens beyond the glass. Emma hesitated in the doorway. "Hello, Miss Isabel," she said softly. The child turned her head slightly, just enough to acknowledge Emma's presence but not enough to meet her eyes. She didn't respond. "If you need anything, just let me know, okay?" Emma tried again, offering a small smile. No response. Isabel simply lowered her gaze back to the book, her fingers gripping the edges of the pages a little too tightly. Emma's chest ached with something she couldn't quite name. This wasn't just loneliness. This was something deeper. Something was wrong in this house. And though she didn't know it yet, that feeling, that gnawing sense of unease, was only the beginning. That night, as Emma settled into bed, exhaustion pulling at her limbs, the mansion fell into a silence so thick it almost felt unnatural. But then, a sound broke through the stillness. Soft, muffled, a child sobbing. Emma sat up instantly, her heart hammering in her chest. It was coming from the second floor. From Isabel's room. Emma lay there, frozen, listening as the quiet weeping continued, barely audible through the thick walls. It was the kind of crying that was meant to be hidden. Controlled, like the child had learned long ago that making noise was dangerous. She swallowed hard. It wasn't her place to interfere. She had been warned, but as she lay there, listening to that small, broken sound, something inside her whispered, "This isn't normal. This isn't just loneliness." And deep down, Emma already knew. She couldn't ignore it. She wouldn't. What she didn't realize then was that this night, this single moment of hesitation, was the first step toward uncovering a dark and terrible secret. One that could cost her everything. The first time Emma heard the crying, she thought she had imagined it. She had been lying in bed, exhausted after her first day at the Johnson mansion, her mind still tangled in the eerie stillness that filled every hallway. Her small room in the staff quarters was tucked away from the main house, its single window offering a limited view of the sprawling estate. The sheets beneath her were crisp, the silence around her so absolute that she could hear her own heartbeat. She had just begun to drift off when the sound reached her, soft, barely more than a whisper against the heavy walls of the mansion. A child's sobs. Emma's eyes snapped open. For a moment, she lay there, listening, convinced her mind was playing tricks on her. But then it came again. This time clearer, more desperate, a muffled, stifled weeping, as though someone were trying to contain it, to keep it from being heard. Her stomach twisted. She sat up, pushing the blanket aside, her bare feet touching the cool wooden floor. The crying was faint, but there was no doubt now, it was coming from somewhere upstairs. From Isabel's room. Emma hesitated. Marta's warning echoed in her mind. Don't ask too many questions. It's better for you. She had only been in the house for a day. She didn't know the full extent of what she was walking into. But the sound of that crying, so broken, so full of pain, wrapped around her heart like a vice. Slowly, cautiously, she stepped toward the door. The staff hallway was empty, the air thick with a kind of unnatural stillness. She made her way toward the grand staircase, her breath shallow as she climbed each step, the cold banister beneath her palm grounding her. The mansion was cavernous at night, the high ceiling swallowing the light from the few dim lamps that lined the hall. Every footstep felt deafening against the silence. She reached the second floor, where the family's bedrooms were. The crying continued. She followed the sound, her pulse hammering as she approached Isabel's door. It was slightly ajar. Emma pressed a hand against the wood, hesitating. She shouldn't be here. If Leonardo caught her, if anyone caught her, she could lose her job. Worse, she could put Isabel in danger. But something inside her refused to turn back. Carefully, she pushed the door open an inch wider and peered inside. The room was dimly lit by a single bedside lamp, casting a golden glow over the plush pink bedding and the delicate furniture. Isabel sat curled up on the floor by the window, her small body trembling, arms wrapped around her knees. Tears streamed down her pale face, her dark eyes glistening in the low light. But she wasn't just crying. She was whispering. Emma strained to hear. At first, she thought Isabel was speaking to someone. But as she listened more closely, she realized the girl was murmuring something to herself. Over and over again. I'm sorry, Daddy. I'll be good. I promise I'll be good. I won't tell. I won't tell. I won't tell. A sharp, icy chill ran down Emma's spine. She felt her knees weaken, her grip tightening on the doorframe. This wasn't just sadness. This wasn't just loneliness. This was fear. Real, crippling fear. And then, suddenly, the floor creaked behind her. Emma turned sharply, her breath catching. Leonardo Johnson stood in the hallway, his towering figure illuminated by the dim wall sconces, his face shadowed and unreadable. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Emma felt frozen, like a deer caught in headlights, her heart thudding so violently she was sure he could hear it. Leonardo tilted his head slightly, his dark eyes piercing. You're up late, he said, his voice smooth but carrying an unmistakable edge. Emma forced herself to swallow past the lump in her throat. I thought I heard something, she said carefully, her voice barely above a whisper. Leonardo's gaze flickered past her, toward the cracked door. For the briefest moment, something flickered in his eyes, something cold, something dark. Then, just as quickly, it was gone. He stepped forward, forcing her to move aside as he reached for the door. Without a word, he pushed it open fully. Isabel's head snapped up, her eyes wide with terror. At the sight of her father, she scrambled to her feet, her small hands trembling at her sides. Leonardo took a slow step into the room. You're supposed to be sleeping, Isabel, he said, his tone eerily gentle. Isabel nodded quickly, swallowing back her sobs, her body going rigid. Come here. She hesitated for only a fraction of a second before obeying, moving toward him with small, careful steps, her head bowed. Leonardo placed a hand on her shoulder. Emma saw her flinch. It was barely noticeable, so slight that most people wouldn't have caught it. But Emma did. She gritted her teeth, forcing herself to remain silent, even as her instincts screamed at her to do something, to pull the girl away. Leonardo turned back to Emma, his hand still resting heavily on his daughter's shoulder. Go back to bed, he said, his voice smooth, controlled. This doesn't concern you. Emma's jaw clenched. Every fiber of her being wanted to argue, wanted to demand answers, wanted to tell him that something was very wrong here. But then she looked at Isabel. At the way her little fingers curled into the hem of her nightgown. At the way her chest rose and fell in quick, shallow breaths. At the sheer terror in her eyes. Emma understood in that moment. Isabel had learned to survive by being invisible. By obeying, by staying silent. And right now, if Emma pushed too hard, if she spoke up, she would only make things worse for the child. So she forced herself to nod. Yes, sir, she said quietly. She turned and walked away, feeling Leonardo's gaze on her back the entire time. But as she descended the staircase, her hands clenched into fists. This wasn't over. She didn't know exactly what Leonardo was doing to Isabel. But she knew one thing for certain. She would find out. And when she did, she would make sure he never laid a hand on that little girl again. For the next few days, Emma watched carefully. She noticed the way Isabel barely spoke at the breakfast table, how she flinched when Leonardo entered the room. She noticed how Clara, the mother, barely acknowledged her daughter at all, her eyes constantly fixed on her phone, her conversations filled with charity events and high society functions. She noticed how the other staff members avoided Isabel's room, how they never spoke her name above a whisper. And most of all, she noticed the bruises, faint, almost hidden, but there, a dark shadow along Isabel's wrist, a small mark beneath her collarbone, just visible when her nightgown slipped slightly at the shoulder. Emma's stomach churned. Every day, Isabel seemed smaller, like she was shrinking into herself, disappearing piece by piece. It wasn't just loneliness. It wasn't just fear. It was something darker, something that had been happening for a long, long time. And Emma knew, if she didn't do something soon, Isabel would be lost completely. That night, as she lay awake in bed, listening to the quiet sobs echoing through the halls once more, Emma made a decision. She didn't care about Marta's warning. She didn't care about the risk. She didn't care that Leonardo Johnson was a powerful man, capable of destroying her with a single command. Because somewhere in that enormous, lifeless mansion, A little girl was crying herself to sleep, believing that no one would ever save her. And Emma? She refused to let that be true. Whatever it took, no matter how dangerous, she was going to protect Isabel. Even if it cost her everything. The first time Emma truly saw the depths of Leonardo Johnson's control. She felt it before she fully understood it. It was in the air, thick and suffocating, pressing down on everyone inside the mansion like an unseen hand. Every staff member walked on eggshells, careful to keep their voices low, their gazes averted. The house was as pristine as a museum. Every object in its place, every surface gleaming under the soft golden light of the chandeliers. But underneath the elegance, the silence was unnatural, as if something terrible lurked beneath the surface, waiting for the wrong moment to reveal itself. The feeling only grew stronger as Emma observed Isabel's interactions with her father, or rather, her lack of interactions. It wasn't just that the girl was quiet, withdrawn, or obedient, it was something else entirely. It was the way she seemed to shrink in his presence. How she made herself smaller whenever he entered the room. It was how she flinched at the sound of his voice. How her body tensed when he moved too close. It was the way her eyes, so wide and dark, never met his for more than a second, as if doing so might somehow provoke him. Emma first witnessed this firsthand during dinner one evening. She had been tasked with serving the meal in the grand dining hall, a space that felt more like a royal courtroom than a family gathering place. The long, polished table could seat at least 20 guests, yet only 4 chairs were occupied. Leonardo sat at the head, his sharp features unreadable, cutting his steak with meticulous precision. Clara sat across from him, barely touching her plate, scrolling through her phone, occasionally nodding to whatever he was saying without looking up. Alexander, Isabel's older brother, had not yet returned home, and so it was just them, and Isabel, who sat stiffly in her chair, pushing her food around her plate without eating. Emma moved carefully, placing a fresh dish of roasted vegetables in the center of the table. She was silent, as she had learned to be, but she couldn't help glancing at Isabel, who had barely taken a bite of her meal. Leonardo noticed, of course. He noticed everything. "Isabel," he said, his voice smooth but carrying an unmistakable authority. The girl froze. Emma instinctively held her breath. "Eat," Leonardo ordered, spearing a piece of meat with his fork. "You've been staring at your plate for 20 minutes. Do you think food is something to be wasted?" Isabel shook her head quickly. "No, sir." "Then eat." Her small hands trembled slightly as she picked up her fork. Emma could see it clearly from where she stood, unnoticed in the background like the rest of the staff. Isabel forced herself to take a bite, chewing slowly, as if each movement was measured. Leonardo watched her closely. Emma didn't move. It was a test. She could feel it in the air. The way Leonardo's gaze never left his daughter's face. The way his fingers tapped ever so slightly against the table. Isabel chewed, swallowed, and took another bite, her hands still shaking. "Good girl," Leonardo finally said, his voice laced with something Emma couldn't quite name: approval, ownership, something far more sinister. Isabel's shoulders sank slightly, as if she had just passed some invisible test. Emma's stomach twisted. It wasn't just about making Isabel eat. It was about control. Every single moment of that interaction had been designed to reinforce it, to remind Isabel that every action she took, even something as small as eating her dinner, was dictated by her father's will. Clara remained silent throughout the exchange, not even glancing up from her phone. Emma gritted her teeth. That night, Isabel cried again. Emma listened, sitting in her bed, her heart aching as she heard the muffled sobs from down the hall. The same broken, desperate weeping, the same whispers. "I'm sorry, Daddy. I'll be good. I promise I'll be good." Emma squeezed her eyes shut. The next day, she tried to talk to Marta again. "Something's wrong with Isabel," she said, cornering the older woman in the kitchen after breakfast. "I hear her crying every night. And Leonardo," she hesitated, lowering her voice, "he watches her like she's a possession, not a daughter." Marta exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand over her face. "I warned you, girl," she murmured. "You don't know what you're getting into." Emma's jaw tightened. "Then tell me." Marta hesitated, glancing over her shoulder as if expecting Leonardo himself to appear. "You ever wonder why Alexander left?" she finally said. "Why he hasn't come back in years?" Emma frowned. She had heard of Alexander, of course, Leonardo's firstborn. the golden son who had supposedly gone overseas to study and rarely returned home. Marta continued, her voice quieter now, because he was just like Isabel once. Young, vulnerable, and Leonardo doesn't like when his children have minds of their own. Emma's stomach turned. Alexander figured it out when he was older. Marta went on, realized the way his father manipulated everything. But by the time he was strong enough to leave, Isabel was still just a baby. He couldn't take her with him. He tried to come back once. But Leonardo made it clear, if Alexander ever tried to interfere, he'd make sure he never saw his sister again. Emma's hands clenched into fists. He's done it before, Marta said, her voice barely more than a whisper now. Isabel's just the next one. Emma felt cold. She had suspected something was wrong. But this was worse than she had imagined. Leonardo wasn't just controlling. He was dangerous. And Isabel was trapped. For the next few days, Emma paid even closer attention. She watched the way Leonardo interacted with his daughter. How his words shaped her every action. How his presence alone made her wilt. She watched how Isabel never laughed, never played, never behaved like a normal child. How every movement was measured, every word spoken with caution. She watched how Clara continued to do nothing. And then, one evening, she saw something that made her blood run cold. Emma had been dusting the bookshelves in the library when she heard quiet voices coming from the hallway. She stepped closer, pressing herself against the wall, listening. Leonardo's voice, low, controlled. Do you know why your mother doesn't love you, Isabel? Emma's breath caught in her throat. A pause. Then Isabel's small voice, barely audible. Because I'm not good enough. A sharp sting of pain shot through Emma's chest. Leonardo's voice was softer now, almost soothing. That's right, he murmured. She never wanted you, Isabel. I'm the only one who's ever been here for you. The only one who loves you. You know that, don't you? Another silence. Then, yes, Daddy. Emma's nails dug into her palms. She wanted to storm into the hallway, grab Isabel, scream at Leonardo that he was a monster, that he was breaking his daughter beyond repair. But she couldn't. Not yet. She needed proof. She needed a way to stop him. She needed to find Alexander. Because Marta had been right, Leonardo had done this before. And if someone didn't stop him, he would keep doing it. Over and over again. Emma refused to let that happen. So that night, as Isabel cried herself to sleep once more, Emma sat in the darkness of her room, planning. Leonardo Johnson thought he had everything under control. He thought he could manipulate, deceive, and break anyone he wanted. But for the first time in years, someone was about to fight back. And Emma? She wasn't going to stop until she tore his empire of control apart. Brick by brick, piece by piece, no matter what it took. Emma Carter had been inside the Johnson mansion for less than 2 weeks when she found out the truth. She had suspected it from the start, the way Isabel flinched when her father spoke. The way her voice trembled when she answered his questions. The way her small frame seemed to shrink into itself whenever he was near. The bruises, the silent crying at night, the way no one, not the staff, not even her own mother, dared to intervene. Something was wrong. But knowing something was wrong and seeing it with her own eyes were two very different things. And when she saw it, when she finally discovered what Leonardo had been doing to his daughter, Emma realized she was no longer just a bystander. She was a witness. And she was going to burn this house of horrors to the ground. It happened late one night, long after the rest of the house had gone to sleep. Emma had just finished cleaning the silverware in the kitchen when she heard it, the sound of footsteps moving down the hall. Quiet but deliberate. The rest of the staff had retired for the night, and the house was supposed to be silent. But someone was awake, and they were heading toward Isabel's room. A cold feeling settled in Emma's stomach as she slowly put down the cloth she had been using. She already knew who it was. The question was, why? Her heart pounded as she stepped out of the kitchen, moving carefully along the darkened corridors. The heavy curtains lining the hallways cast deep shadows, turning the grand estate into something out of a nightmare. She followed the sound of the footsteps, keeping her own movements light. And then, she saw him, Leonardo Johnson, standing at Isabel's bedroom door. Emma froze, her breath catching in her throat. His hand was on the doorknob. He wasn't knocking. He wasn't calling for her. He was going inside. Every instinct inside Emma screamed at her to stop him, to shove him away, to scream, to wake the entire household. But she couldn't move, she couldn't breathe, because in that moment, she saw everything. She saw the way his fingers lingered on the door handle. She saw the way he exhaled, slow and deliberate, before turning the knob and stepping inside. And worst of all, she saw Isabel, sitting up in bed, frozen, waiting, like she had been through this before. Emma felt something snap inside her. She had suspected, she had wondered, she had even prepared herself for the worst. But this was monstrous. Emma's hands clenched into fists, her nails digging into her palms. She couldn't let this happen. Not again. Not ever again. Moving quickly, she stepped back into the shadows, pressing herself against the wall. Her pulse roared in her ears as she waited, breath shallow, her entire body trembling with fury and fear. A minute passed, then another. She didn't dare move. Then, Leonardo stepped out. His expression was calm, his posture was relaxed, as if nothing had happened. As if he hadn't just walked into his daughter's room in the dead of night. As if he hadn't left her behind with nothing but silent tears and the kind of fear no child should ever have to carry. Emma felt bile rise in her throat as she watched him walk away, disappearing down the hallway, his shadow stretching long across the marble floor. She should go after him. She should scream. She should run to Isabel's room and tell her she wasn't alone. That someone knew, that someone cared. But she couldn't. Not yet. She needed proof. Because monsters like Leonardo Johnson didn't just lose everything overnight. They had to be destroyed. Emma barely slept that night. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying the scene over and over again in her head. The way Leonardo had walked into that room. The way Isabel had sat there, frozen in terror. The way the entire mansion had swallowed it up, as if it were nothing. She had heard stories like this before. Stories whispered in small towns, hidden behind closed doors. Stories where powerful men did unspeakable things and no one ever spoke out because they were afraid. But she wasn't afraid. Not anymore. By morning, she had made her decision. She was going to find Elena Brown. It wasn't easy tracking down the former nanny. Emma had to be careful. Leonardo had eyes everywhere. And if he found out she was digging into the past, she would be out of that house before she could even think about helping Isabel. But she wasn't alone. Marta, despite her initial warnings, had started to see Emma. She had seen the fire in her eyes, the determination in her stance. And in the end, she had given Emma the last known address of Elena Brown. She tried to save Isabel once. Marta had whispered, slipping her a small piece of paper. But she failed. You need to be smarter than she was. Emma had nodded, gripping the paper like a lifeline. She wouldn't fail. She couldn't. When Emma found Elena, the woman was nothing like she had imagined. She wasn't a frightened, broken shell of a person. She was angry. The moment she heard Leonardo's name, her expression darkened. He's still hurting her, isn't he? Elena asked, her hands tightening into fists. Emma nodded, her throat tight. Elena exhaled, shaking her head. I tried, she whispered. God, I tried. I went to the police. I told them everything. But Leonardo, he had them all in his pocket. They told me to leave it alone. Emma's stomach twisted. But he made one mistake. Elena continued, looking Emma dead in the eyes. What mistake? Emma asked, leaning forward. Elena's expression hardened. He doesn't know I kept the letters. Letters. Isabel's letters. The ones Leonardo forced her to write. The ones where he made her say she hated her mother. The ones where he made her believe he was the only person who loved her. Elena had copies. Proof. And Emma? Emma had a plan. Because this wasn't just about saving Isabel anymore. This was about exposing Leonardo Johnson for the monster he was. It was about making sure he never hurt anyone ever again. And she needed your help. If you've made it this far, if you're feeling even an ounce of the anger, the horror, the urgency that Emma is feeling right now, like, comment, share this. Because this story isn't just Emma's fight. It's ours. It's about standing up to people like Leonardo. It's about giving Isabel a voice when she's been silenced for too long. And together, we're going to take him down. Stay tuned. The war has just begun. Emma Carter had never felt more alone in her life. The weight of the truth pressed down on her like an invisible force. Suffocating and relentless. She knew now, without a shadow of a doubt, that Leonardo Johnson was more than just a controlling, manipulative father. He was a monster A man who had spent years breaking his daughter, shaping her mind like a sculptor molding clay, until she believed he was the only thing she had left. But Emma wasn't just going to stand by and watch. She had already taken the first step. She had found Elena Brown, the former nanny, and she now held proof in her hands. Isabel's letters, the ones Leonardo had forced her to write, the ones filled with lies about her mother, the ones designed to ensure that Isabel never trusted anyone but him. But proof wasn't enough. Not against a man like Leonardo. If she wanted to bring him down, she needed help. She needed Alexander. Finding Alexander Johnson was easier said than done. The golden son of the Johnson family, the heir who had fled, was practically a ghost. He had left years ago, vanishing into a life far away from his father's reach. But Emma knew he hadn't really disappeared. Because no matter how far he had run, his sister was still trapped in the house he had escaped. And if there was one thing she knew about people who had survived abuse, it was this: they never truly forget the ones they left behind. Marta was the one who helped her find him. "You're serious about this, aren't you?" the older woman asked, watching Emma carefully as she slipped a small piece of paper across the counter. Emma didn't hesitate. "Dead serious." Marta exhaled, shaking her head. "You're playing with fire, girl." Emma's hands curled into fists. "Then I guess it's time Leonardo got burned." Alexander Johnson lived in a sleek apartment on the other side of the city, far removed from the cold, suffocating walls of the mansion he had grown up in. When Emma knocked on his door, she wasn't sure if he would even open it. But after a long pause, she heard movement from inside. And then, the door swung open. The man who stood before her wasn't the boy in the pictures. The boy in the pictures had been young, polished, trained to be perfect. This man, he was different. His once perfectly styled hair was slightly messy, his jawline rough with the shadow of a beard. But the biggest change was his eyes. They weren't hollow like Isabel's, but they weren't whole either. There was something in them, something guarded, something that had seen too much, something that had never quite healed. And when he spoke, his voice was rough with exhaustion. "Who the hell are you?" Emma took a deep breath. "My name is Emma Carter," she said, meeting his gaze. "I work at the mansion." Something in his expression darkened instantly. She saw it. The way his body tensed. The way his grip on the doorframe tightened. The mansion. The word alone was enough to send him back. "I don't know what you think you're doing, but I want nothing to do with that place," Alexander said, stepping back. "Go back to whatever job you signed up for. It's not my problem anymore." Emma's heart pounded. He was going to close the door. He was going to walk away. And Isabel was still inside. She couldn't let him leave. So before he could shut her out, she pulled out the letters. The ones written by his sister. And she held them up, her hands shaking. "Read them." Alexander froze. For a long moment, he just stared at the papers, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly, almost reluctantly, he took them from her hands. Emma watched as his eyes scanned the first page, then the second, then the third. And as he read, his face changed, his shoulders tensed, his jaw clenched, his breathing grew sharp and uneven, like someone trying not to break. Emma stayed silent, waiting. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "He made her write these?" Emma swallowed hard. "Every night." A beat of silence. Then, Alexander slammed his fist into the doorframe. Emma flinched at the impact. But she didn't move away. Because she saw what was happening. She saw the way his hands trembled. She saw the way his chest rose and fell. Too fast. Too shallow. She saw the way he looked at the letters like they were something that could kill him. And she knew, in that moment, he had spent years running from this. But the past had just caught up with him. When Alexander finally spoke again, his voice was hoarse. "What do you want me to do?" Emma exhaled. "We need to stop him." Alexander laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You think it's that easy?" he muttered. "You think you can just waltz into that house and stop him? You don't know what he's capable of." Emma lifted her chin. "Maybe not," she admitted, "but I know what he's doing to Isabel. And I know what he's done to you." Alexander looked away. Silence stretched between them. And then, finally, he nodded. "Okay," he murmured. "I'm in." The next step was Clara. Emma wasn't sure if she could be saved. For years, Clara Johnson had turned a blind eye to her husband's behavior. She had ignored Isabel's fear. allowed Leonardo to manipulate their daughter into believing she was unlovable, and never once fought back. But maybe, just maybe, she had done it to survive. And if she had spent years surviving, maybe she could finally learn to fight. Maybe it was time for her to wake up. And Emma was going to make sure she did. When they walked into Clara's private sitting room together, the woman blinked in surprise. Alexander, she breathed. Her son, the one who had left. The son who had run away and never looked back. Alexander didn't smile. Instead, he placed Isabel's letters on the table. Clara frowned. What's this? Emma crossed her arms. Your daughter's words. Clara hesitated, then, slowly, she reached out and picked up the first letter. As her eyes scanned the page, her hand shook. Then she read the second letter. The third. The fourth. Tears welled in her eyes. But she didn't let them fall. When she finally looked up, she was pale. Leonardo made her write these? She whispered. Yes, Alexander said. His voice was hard. Clara swallowed. And for the first time in years, she looked at her son, really looked at him. And she saw something she had refused to see before. She saw him. The little boy she had left alone in that house. The son she had failed to protect. And now, it was happening again. But this time, she could do something about it. She exhaled, closing her eyes. And when she opened them, there was fire there. She looked at her son. Then at Emma. Then at the letters. And then she said the words that sealed Leonardo Johnson's fate. What do we do now? This is it. The fight has begun. Emma has found her allies. Alexander has returned. Clara is awake. But the battle isn't over yet. Leonardo doesn't know what's coming for him. And we're going to make sure he never sees it coming. If you've made it this far, comment below. Tell Emma to keep going. Tell Alexander to stay strong. Tell Clara that it's not too late to save her daughter. Because this is only the beginning. And we're not stopping until Leonardo Johnson falls. Emma Carter had been waiting for this moment. She had spent weeks trapped inside the walls of the Johnson mansion, suffocating under the weight of its secrets. She had watched the way Leonardo twisted his daughter's mind, the way he forced her into silence, the way he made her believe she had no one but him. She had seen the bruises, heard the muffled cries, and witnessed the cold, calculating control he exerted over his entire family. But now, it was his turn to be afraid. Because Emma wasn't alone anymore. Alexander had returned. Clara had finally woken up. And together, they were going to take everything from Leonardo Johnson. The monster who had spent years controlling his family was about to lose everything. It started with the evidence. Emma, Alexander, and Clara locked themselves in Clara's study. The air thick with tension. The table before them was covered with documents, Isabel's forced letters, fraudulent financial records, proof of Leonardo's offshore accounts. It was everything they needed to destroy him. Not just as a father, but as a man. Clara sat stiffly in her chair, her manicured hands gripping the edges of the table. She hadn't spoken much since reading Isabel's letters. She had been silent, but her silence was not weakness anymore. It was something else. It was rage. It was calculation. And when she finally spoke, her voice was steady. We take this to the press first. Alexander nodded. If we go to the police first, Leonardo will bury it. He still has people on his payroll. Emma clenched her fists. We need someone who can't be bought. Clara exhaled, glancing at the papers. I know someone. Emma and Alexander exchanged glances. Who? Clara's lips pressed into a thin line. An independent journalist. She's ruthless when it comes to stories like this. If we give her the evidence, she'll make sure the entire world sees it. Emma felt something shift inside her. For the first time, they had a real chance. For the first time, Leonardo wasn't the one in control anymore. They met the journalist, Margot Hayes, in a small cafe on the other side of the city. She was in her mid-40s. Her dark hair streaked with gray. Her sharp brown eyes scanning them with an intensity that made even Clara hesitate. You better not be wasting my time, Margot said, setting down her cup of coffee. Alexander slid the folder across the table. Margot opened it, and as she read, her expression changed. At first, it was neutral, professional detachment. But then, her hands tightened on the pages. Her lips parted slightly. Her breathing slowed. And when she finally looked up at them, her expression was dark. This is big, she said. Bigger than I thought. Clara straightened. Will you publish it? Margot leaned back, tapping her nails against the table. If I do this, it's going to make waves. Leonardo has power, connections. He'll fight back. Alexander's jaw tightened. We know. Margot's gaze flickered to Emma. You believe all this? Emma's hands clenched into fists. I've seen it. Margot studied her for a long moment. Then she exhaled, shutting the folder with a decisive snap. Then let's burn him to the ground. The article was published 2 days later. And the world exploded. The headline alone sent shockwaves through high society. The Johnson Empire. Built on fraud and abuse. Emma read it over and over again, her heart pounding as the words spread like wildfire. The article exposed everything. Leonardo's financial corruption, his emotional abuse of Isabel. The letters, the horrible, gut-wrenching letters, were printed in full. By noon, every major news outlet had picked up the story. By 3 p.m., Leonardo's business partners were already cutting ties. By 6 p.m., the police were at the mansion. And by 9 p.m., Leonardo Johnson was gone. Emma, Alexander, and Clara stood in the grand foyer, the air thick with anticipation. They had expected Leonardo to fight, to deny, to threaten, but instead, he had disappeared. There were no calls from his lawyers, no statements to the press, no desperate attempts to cling to his empire. Just silence. Clara's hands trembled as she hugged Isabel close. Where is he? She whispered. Alexander's expression was grim. Running. Emma swallowed hard, looking at Isabel. The little girl clung to her mother. Her mother. For the first time in years. And for the first time, there was hope in her eyes. They had won, haven't they? But the next morning, everything changed. Emma woke up to the sound of shattering glass. She sat up, her heart pounding. Another crash. A scream. Then, where is SHE? Leonardo. Emma's blood ran cold. She threw open her door, running toward the sound, and when she reached the staircase, she froze. Leonardo Johnson stood in the middle of the grand foyer, his face twisted with rage. His expensive suit was disheveled, his usually sleek hair wild, his eyes burning, and he wasn't alone. 2 men stood behind him, big, dressed in black. Emma's stomach dropped. This wasn't over. It had never been over. Leonardo had come back for Isabel. And he was going to destroy anyone who stood in his way. Emma barely had time to react before Leonardo's gaze snapped to her. You, he hissed. She took a step back. You did this. Emma's mouth went dry. Alexander appeared at the top of the staircase. Get the hell out, he said, his voice low and dangerous. Leonardo's lips curled into a snarl. You think you can take my daughter from me? Clara stepped into view, her arms wrapped protectively around Isabel. You already lost her, she said. Leonardo's fists clenched. Then, he lunged. Everything happened in a blur. A struggle. A shouted command. A gun. A gun. Leonardo's hand shot to his waistband. Emma's heart stopped. Alexander moved first. A crash. A gunshot. And then silence. When the dust settled, Leonardo was on the ground. The gun, his gun, lay several feet away. Alexander stood over him, breathing hard. And the police were already there. Leonardo Johnson was dragged away in handcuffs. The last thing Emma saw was his face. Twisted in rage, defeated. And then, he was gone. The mansion fell into silence. Then, a sob. Isabel. Clara held her daughter close, whispering soothing words. Emma felt something break inside her. It was over. Finally. Truly. Over. If you've made it this far, comment below. Tell Isabel that she is safe. Tell Emma that she fought for something bigger than herself. Tell Alexander that he didn't run away this time. Because this was their victory. And now, it's time to heal. The Johnson mansion stood eerily silent. For the first time in years, there were no muffled cries, no whispered apologies, no tension pressing against the air like an invisible weight. The monster was gone. Leonardo Johnson, once a man who ruled his family with fear, was now nothing more than a bad memory. A cautionary tale of what happens when power is abused. And yet, even in his absence, the damage he had caused lingered. Because scars don't disappear overnight. And neither did the fear. Emma Carter sat on the edge of her bed in the staff quarters, staring at her packed suitcase. It was over. She had done what she came to do. She had helped Isabel. She had stood beside Alexander and Clara as they fought to break free. And now, it was time to leave. Wasn't it? But as she gripped the worn handle of her bag, she hesitated, because something inside her whispered that her job wasn't finished yet. Not really. Because even though Leonardo was gone, his shadow still remained. And Isabel? Isabel was still learning what it meant to live without fear. That morning, the house felt different, lighter, as if, for the first time in its history, it could finally breathe. Emma stepped out of her room and made her way downstairs, where she found Alexander and Clara sitting at the breakfast table. It was strange, seeing them there together. For so long, Alexander had stayed away, and Clara had spent years turning a blind eye. But now, they sat across from each other. The silence between them no longer suffocating but cautious, uncertain, as if they were trying to figure out what a family was supposed to look like. And then there was Isabel. She sat between them, staring at the plate in front of her. She wasn't trembling. She wasn't crying. She wasn't pushing her food around in silent agony, afraid to upset her father. But she wasn't eating either. She simply sat there, her small fingers gripping the edge of the table, lost, as if she didn't know what to do now that she was free. Emma's heart ached. "Good morning, Isa," she said gently, stepping closer. Isabel blinked, glancing up at her. She still looked hesitant, as if she wasn't sure how to respond. Because for so long, good mornings had been followed by expectations, orders, consequences. But now, the words held no weight. Now, they were just words. "Good morning," Isabel finally whispered. It wasn't much, but it was something. And for now, something was enough. The first few days were difficult. Isabel flinched at loud noises. She hesitated before speaking, as if expecting punishment to follow. She barely left her room, clinging to her books like they were the only safe thing in the world. And at night, she still cried. But now, when Emma listened, it wasn't the same desperate, suffocated sobbing. It was different. It was grief. It was the slow realization that her life had changed. That she didn't have to be afraid anymore. But she didn't know how to exist outside of fear. And neither did Clara. Clara Johnson had spent years pretending. Pretending she didn't see. Pretending she didn't hear. Pretending it was easier to let Leonardo win than to fight for what mattered. And now she had to learn how to be a mother again. She spent hours sitting outside Isabel's door, waiting. She tried talking to her, tried coaxing her into conversation. But Isabel would just nod or whisper short replies. And every time Clara looked at her daughter, guilt swam in her eyes. Because she had let this happen. She had let Leonardo steal Isabel's childhood. And she didn't know if she could ever make up for that. But she wanted to try. She wanted to be better. She wanted to be the mother Isabel had needed all along. But the road to healing? It wasn't an easy one. One afternoon, Emma found Isabel sitting in the garden. The same garden she had always stared at from her bedroom window but had never actually stepped foot in. Emma approached slowly, careful not to startle her. She sat down beside her, watching as Isabel traced small patterns in the dirt with her fingers. "What are you thinking about?" Emma asked. Isabel hesitated. Then, "Do you think he's coming back?" Emma's throat tightened. "No," she said softly. "He's not coming back, Isa." Isabel swallowed hard, nodding. But Emma could see it in her eyes. The fear, the doubt, the part of her that still believed that monsters never really go away. And Emma didn't know how to erase that fear. She didn't know if it would ever truly disappear. So instead, she did the only thing she could. She reached out and took Isabel's hand in hers. "You're safe now," she whispered. "I promise." And for the first time, Isabel didn't pull away. The days turned into weeks. Little by little, the darkness began to lift. Isabel started eating again. She started speaking in full sentences. She even laughed once, a small, breathless sound that made Clara burst into tears. It wasn't perfect. There were still nightmares. There were still moments of silence that stretched too long. But the important thing was, they were healing, together. And Emma? She realized something. She didn't want to leave. Not yet. Because this family, this broken, wounded family, wasn't just surviving anymore. They were fighting to rebuild themselves. And Emma wanted to see them win. One evening, Clara pulled Emma aside. They stood in the kitchen, the scent of fresh tea filling the air. "You're not just a housekeeper. You know," Clara said softly. Emma frowned. What do you mean? Clara smiled, but there were tears in her eyes. You saved us, she whispered. You saved my daughter. You saved my son. You saved me. Emma's throat tightened. She had never thought of it that way. She had just done what was right. What needed to be done. But Clara wasn't finished. We don't want you to leave, she said. You're family now. Emma's breath hitched. Family. She had spent her whole life drifting from place to place, never truly belonging anywhere. But here, in this house that had once been nothing but a prison, she had found something she never expected. A home, a purpose, and a family that wanted her to stay. Tears welled in her eyes as she nodded. I'll stay, she whispered, as long as you'll have me. Clara reached forward, squeezing her hand. Then it settled, and in that moment, for the first time in her life, Emma Carter knew she was exactly where she was meant to be. This is the part of the story that matters most. Not the pain, not the fear, but the healing, the new beginnings, the reminder that even the darkest pasts can lead to brighter futures. For the first time in years, the Johnson mansion was no longer a place of fear. It had once been a house of shadows, where laughter was stifled, where every footstep was carefully measured, where Isabel Johnson had learned to exist in silence because speaking too loudly might wake the monster that ruled her world. But that monster was gone now. Leonardo Johnson, the man who had used his power to twist and control, had been dragged away in handcuffs. And for the first time, Isabel was learning what it meant to live without looking over her shoulder. But freedom was not as easy as it seemed. Because when you've lived your entire life in a cage, stepping outside of it can feel just as terrifying as staying in. At first, Isabel didn't know what to do with herself. She wasn't sure how to exist in a world where no one told her when to sleep, when to eat, when to be quiet. She didn't know how to make choices for herself, how to trust that there wouldn't be punishment waiting around the corner. So she hesitated. She tiptoed around the house, waiting for rules that no longer existed. She still sat at the dinner table with her hands in her lap, eyes downcast, even though no one was watching her anymore. She still flinched when a door closed too loudly. She still whispered apologies when there was nothing to apologize for. And every night, she still woke up in a cold sweat, gripping the blankets like they were the only thing keeping her grounded. The fear wasn't gone. Not yet. It had been too deeply ingrained. But the difference now? Now, she wasn't alone. Now, she had people who refused to let her disappear inside herself. Alexander had taken to checking on her constantly, as if making up for lost time. Do you want to go out for ice cream? He asked one afternoon. Standing awkwardly at her bedroom door, Isabel blinked at him, tilting her head. She had never been asked if she wanted something before. And for a moment, she wasn't sure how to answer. Ice cream? She echoed, her voice barely above a whisper. Alexander smiled, his eyes warm. Yeah, you know, cold, sweet, makes your tongue turn funny colors? A pause. Then, a hesitant, almost disbelieving nod. Okay, Isabel whispered. And when they went, sitting in a small shop downtown with their cones slowly melting in their hands, Alexander watched as his little sister smiled for the first time. A small smile, tentative, but real. And for him, that was everything. Clara was struggling too. She had spent so long looking the other way, so long pretending that the cracks in her family weren't real, that now, faced with the reality of what she had ignored, she didn't know how to fix it. So she did the only thing she could. She tried. Every day, she tried. She sat beside Isabel while she colored. Even when the little girl barely acknowledged her presence, she started tucking her in at night, whispering soft words of comfort. Even though Isabel still flinched at unexpected touches, she waited. She didn't push. She didn't demand. She just let Isabel know she was there. And one evening, when she kissed her daughter's forehead and whispered, "I love you," Isabel whispered it back. Emma stayed too. She didn't have to. She could have packed her bags, walked out the door, and left the Johnsons to rebuild their lives without her. But she couldn't. Not yet. Because this family still had battles to fight. And Isabel? Isabel still needed her. So Emma stayed. She walked with Isabel in the garden, teaching her how to plant flowers, how to put life back into a place that had once been nothing but cold walls. She sat beside her during meals, reminding her that she didn't have to ask permission to eat. And when Isabel woke up screaming in the middle of the night, Trapped in a nightmare she couldn't escape. Emma was always there, holding her hand, telling her, "You're safe now." And slowly, so slowly, Isabel began to believe it. One day, weeks after Leonardo's arrest, Emma found Isabel standing at the front door, staring outside. The little girl's fingers curled against the wood, her dark eyes scanning the world beyond the gate. She wasn't afraid. Not exactly. She was thinking, wondering, dreaming. Emma knelt beside her. "What are you looking at, Isa?" Isabel hesitated. Then, softly, "The world." Emma's heart clenched. Because for the first time, Isabel was imagining a life outside of this house. She was imagining freedom, a future, something more. And Emma knew, this was it. This was the beginning. The beginning of Isabel's real life. The beginning of her healing. The beginning of a future without fear. This is what survival looks like. It's not just escaping the monster. It's learning how to live again. It's choosing to take back the life that was stolen. And Isabel? She's doing it. She's fighting. She's healing. And she's proving that no matter how much pain a person has endured, they can still find their way to happiness, to love, to life. So if you've made it this far, comment below. Tell Isabel that she is strong. Tell Alexander that he is the big brother she deserves. Tell Clara that she still has time to make things right. And tell Emma that she was never just a housekeeper. She was the reason they all survived. The sun had begun to set over the Johnson estate, casting golden hues over the once oppressive mansion. It wasn't a house of horrors anymore. It wasn't a place where fear ruled, where every word was measured, and where silence was the only thing keeping people safe. Now, it was something else entirely. It was a home. It was filled with warmth, with hesitant laughter, with voices that once trembled but now carried strength. It was a place where Isabel Johnson was finally learning how to live. And it was a place Emma Carter would never forget. It had been months since Leonardo Johnson had been dragged away in handcuffs. His empire crumbling beneath the weight of his own darkness. The world had turned against him. His business partners abandoned him. His name was smeared across headlines. A cautionary tale of what happens when men abuse their power. His bank accounts were frozen. His lawyers were outmatched. And for the first time in his life, Leonardo was facing something he never had before. Consequences. Justice had finally caught up to him. And his family? They were free. But freedom wasn't simple. It wasn't just waking up one day and realizing the nightmare was over. Because when you've lived in fear for so long, you don't know how to exist outside of it. Isabel struggled. She still hesitated before speaking, as if expecting punishment to follow. She still looked over her shoulder when she walked into a room, as if her father might be standing in the shadows. And sometimes, in the quiet of the night, she still woke up crying. But the difference now? Now, someone was always there. Now, she wasn't alone. Now, she had people who loved her. Alexander, who had once run away, had become the brother Isabel always needed. He taught her how to ride a bike, how to pick out her own books at the library, how to take up space in a world that had tried to make her small. Clara, the mother who had once looked the other way, was now making up for lost time. She was learning how to love her daughter the way she should have all along. She no longer placed charity events above family dinners. She no longer avoided hard conversations. She no longer left Isabel to fend for herself. Instead, she sat with her every night, reading stories, brushing her hair, whispering to her that she was safe. And little by little, Isabel started to believe it. And Emma? Emma had stayed long enough to watch it happen. But now, it was time for her to go. Because she had come into this house as an outsider. And she was leaving knowing that her job was done. She had fought for Isabel. She had fought for Clara. She had fought for a family that had been shattered and was now being put back together, piece by piece. And as she stood at the doorway, her bag over her shoulder, Isabel ran up to her, eyes wide with panic. "You're leaving?" the little girl whispered. Emma knelt down, placing a gentle hand on Isabel's shoulder. "I have to," she said softly, "but that doesn't mean I'm gone." Isabel swallowed hard. "But what if I still get scared?" she asked. Emma smiled. "You will," she said honestly, "and that's okay. But you know what you do when you're scared, Isa?" Isabel shook her head. "You remember that you are not alone." Emma took her hand, squeezing gently. "You have Alexander. You have your mom. You have people who love you. And you?" She tapped a finger against Isabel's heart. "You are the bravest person I've ever met." Isabel's lower lip trembled. Then, without hesitation, she threw her arms around Emma's neck. Emma closed her eyes, hugging her back, and in that moment, she knew this was the ending Isabel deserved. As Emma walked away from the mansion for the last time, she thought about everything that had happened. She thought about the fear she had once felt, the secrets that had been buried in those walls, the pain that had gone ignored for far too long. And she thought about how it had all changed, how it had taken courage to fight back, how it had taken love to rebuild, how it had taken time to heal. And as she stepped onto the quiet street, the cool wind brushing against her face, she smiled. Because this story? It wasn't just about what was lost. It was about what was found. A mother who had finally opened her eyes. A brother who had come back to protect his sister. A little girl who had learned that she was worth saving. And a woman who had walked into their lives at the right time and changed everything. This is what survival looks like. It's messy. It's painful. It's slow. But it is possible. Because no matter how dark the past may be, the future can still be bright. And Isabel? She has a future now. One where fear does not define her. One where love is stronger than the pain she has endured. One where she is safe. One where she is free. And that is the ending she deserved all along. If you've made it this far, this is your moment to do something powerful. Comment below. Tell Isabel that she is strong. Tell Alexander that he is the brother she always needed. Tell Clara that she is redeemed. Tell Emma that she didn't just change their lives, she saved them. And if this story meant something to you, like this video, subscribe to the channel. Because these stories, they are more than just words. They are reminders that no matter how dark the past, there is always hope. And you are never truly alone. See you in the next story.